Welcome to Bach in the Bedroom, episode 2. Today I want to talk about the idea of technique. Oftentimes in mainstream conservatory education, we are taught technique as if it adheres to universal absolute principles. We're taught that if we have a perfect or approaching perfect technique, we will be able to represent and express ideas, thoughts, musical interpretations at our will. I don't necessarily want to disagree with the idea that technique is very important, but I also want to draw attention to the ways in which technique is historically constructed by violinists, teachers, and institutions. I want to look specifically at a treatise by Bartolomeo Campagnoli, who was a violinist who lived between 1751 and 1827, and who played in the Leipzig Gewandhaus Orchestra between 1797 and 1818. Why look at Campagnoli's treatise? Basically, I think it gives a really great illustration of how modern violinists in his time were starting to think about technique as this kind of exhaustive list of principles and lessons that could be programmed into the body to paint a picture of the complete violinist of the time. He also draws from a lot of historical treatises. His treatise follows the same method as Geminiani's. So the way the treatise works is that it has 250 lessons. The lessons are basically text descriptions of certain principles, ideas, or techniques. The studies, on the other hand, put the lessons into notated form with the idea that a student will practice these studies and by practicing them, internalize them, and program them into their bodies. So here's an example. Lesson number 156 is a study passing through the first three positions in different passages in double notes and serving to familiarize the pupil with several passages practicable in the third position. So I've drawn this kind of conceptual map of how this works. Basically, the square represents one of these lessons programmed into the violinist's body through these studies. The image of the violinist has all these squares kind of checkered around their body, showing the ways in which these lessons would regulate, the fingers, the arms, the hands, the head, the necks, the shoulders of these violin students, with the idea that these lessons are kind of templates for musical production and reproduction, which form and structure our bodies. In the example that we just looked at, lesson number 156, Campagnoli refers to a musical work of his that employs this principle of moving between the three positions. This work is the 6 fugues for solo violin, opus 10. Here I want to look at the 4th fugue from this collection in order to show the ways in which he employs this particular study and lesson in a musical context. So first he shifts up the 3 positions in these in a sequence of double stops. And then he shifts back down the 3 positions in this descending sequence. This is kind of interesting because it shows the correspondence between the treatise and the musical work. It's not that he's writing music necessarily for the sake of writing music. He's writing music basically to illustrate and employ different techniques. So there's a way in which the body and bodily technique actually serves as a generative structure for musical composition. So the next example, again from the same fugue by Campagnoli, employs the same principle of shifting hand positions, but this time adds a bunch of tricky string crossings. The practice of these string crossings is also programmed into the treatise. Number 87, lesson 87, is a study for acquiring flexibility in the wrist, and facility in skipping from an upper to a lower string. So this kind of presents a simpler example of these kinds of string crossings outside of the context of a musical piece or a fugue. So we see in this progressive study the way in which there's this idea that you can teach technique from first principles, that you can kind of start with let's do hand positions and string crossings and ornamentation and bow control, and program each of these individual things and kind of stack them on top of each other so that we have this complete violinist who can do all of these things, use them to compose their own music, and also use them to play all the music of other people. So I want to ask the question, who did this formation of technique serve? Campagnoli was writing at a pivotal moment in practice in which classical music started to take its modern form. That is, classical music started focusing on the past, on music written by historical composers. Campagnoli was writing this in the early years of the Paris Conservatoire, which was established in 1795. As the musicologist Kailan Rubinoff points out, the Paris Conservatoire was originally an outgrowth of the French National Guard, so it had a kind of military discipline and hierarchy programmed into it on the administrative level. Not only this, Paris Conservatoire really established a curriculum based on the reproduction of canons of musical works by the likes of Beethoven, also early violin masters like Viotti, Paganini, Kreutzer, Rode, Baillot, etc. So the kind of military organization of the Paris Conservatoire encompassed everything from hierarchies of administration and teaching to the formation of symphony orchestras and the standardization of bodily discipline on the individual level. So there are ways in which Campagnoli's treatise serves similar goals in terms of regulating and standardizing how the body is supposed to work in order to hold these canons, histories, and forms of hierarchy and discipline in place. So returning to the kind of conceptual map of the body, we see the ways in which these templates are formed by history, and also the ways in which they continue to shape present bodies, like my own, for example. Returning to the question of who did this formation of technique serve, well, it served these institutions, and these institutions, who they served, that's a pretty debatable question. There was, on one hand, the fact that the Paris Conservatoire happened in the wake of the French Revolution, and so was, in some sense, a kind of liberating, equalizing force in terms of providing education to more than simply the aristocrats and noble elite. On the other hand, it formed and instilled its own forms of enduring hierarchy and discipline. So I want to kind of leave it at this idea that there is a way in which technique is, in the old European model, is still certainly desirable and empowering knowledge for many musicians, but also point out that it excludes actually most forms of musicality other than those that kind of arose out of the 18th and 19th century. But I do want to leave with this question of who and what do we want our bodily discipline to serve? We've inherited this mode of playing, of executing things on the violin. We've trained our bodies to do this. So how do we want to direct and redirect it?